fraud allegations, the government tends to sort of sit back and wait, right? They're going to let you enter those goods, and they're going to be watching what you're doing and kind of building their case, right? So like the one historical case that most people in the importing community know about is the honey fraud cases.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hello, folks. This is Andy Shiles and Lalo Solorzano for Simply Trade Podcast. We're open up for another show today. We're going to have a good discussion today. I think it's going to be great. This is a fella that, Lalo, why don't you talk about how you found this guy? This it sounds like he's smarter than the average bear here.
Yeah. So I'm, I guess, some of the kids these days might be, might call me a creeper, I guess. I creep through people's, not Instagram. So I'm sorry, I don't do Instagram. LinkedIn. But what I'm doing is actually called research, not creeping. So anyway, so I'm researching and looking at posts and, of course, reading and keeping up with all the trade stuff. And I wanted to kind of deviate a little away from tariffs and tariffs and all that. And so kind of just go into like, it was evident in our past show that we had actual importers, right? We had a couple of folks from an importing, that they're a manufacturer and they were importing. So we kind of want to get their perspective on how trade is going with them. And so I saw this post by someone that said something really interesting about the Department of Justice, how they're having their priority on prosecuting or going after, let's call it bad actors or things that are not correct. And the number two area that they're looking at going after now is customs fraud. So in other words, importers that are reporting things incorrectly. And so we'll let our guest talk about that. So his name, Edward, but he's known by EJ. And y'all probably have seen him on LinkedIn. He's pretty active on there. Again, that's why I had been seeing his posts pop up on my feed. And so I thought, oh, wow, this one's pretty cool. And so that's how I came about, and I found EJ through, again, my research. So
Excellent. Well, EJ Thomas, welcome to the show. We're going to have your contact information out there with our show notes for anybody that's interested in this. And I'll tell you that, folks, this is something that if you think that your competitors are doing something, if you think even with your own company you're doing some things that somebody's trying a little shenanigans or whatever, this may be a show that you can share with some folks, because this is like cross your T's, dot your I's, make sure you're doing it right. But EJ, welcome to our show today.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate being here.
Hold on, I was gonna say a little joke here. So I guess 3M was taken, so y'all had to that brand name was taken, so you had to resort to your founders, I guess, or partners' names, which is the law firm is Morris, Manning, and Martin. So I just wanted to get that out. So.
That's right. And some folks call us Triple M. Some folks call us MMM or Law. So yeah, lots of jokes.
So where are you located there, EJ?
So I'm in Washington, D.C., sort of at the heart of all the trade wars that are happening right now.
Of course. So with that is what seems to be, from your perspective here, you, by the way, folks, take a look at EJ Thomas on LinkedIn, because he posted an article that's worth reading, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. But with that, I guess, is what seems to be the trend right now. I mean, everybody's been talking tariff and all that, but we're going to shift gears here a little bit. It seems like you've got an interesting viewpoint here on some things.
Yeah. So, I mean, with tariffs comes enforcement, right? And so, what this memo that came out of the Department of Justice Criminal Division talks about is enforcement, right? And so, I think for maybe the first time in history, the Department of Justice's Criminal Division is prioritizing enforcement of trade and customs fraud, including tariff evasion. And they've listed it as their number 2 enforcement priority. And so, what that means is you're definitely going to start seeing the application of criminal statutes related to customs and tariff evasion. And so I think that's really a scary thing because historically, these types of issues, customs fraud, tariff evasion, have been mostly addressed in a civil matter. Customs and Border Protection has lots of different things that they can do, from 1592 or 592 investigations. Those are penalty investigations. There's, the Enforce and Protect Act, which deals with anti-dumping and countervailing duty evasion. And even the Department of Justice, their civil division, has various ways in which they can go after these kinds of things. So this is really a huge development, because what typically has been a civil matter, you pay a fine, whatever, is now being transformed into a completely criminal matter. And so I think that's a really huge deal. And I think you're just going to start seeing a lot more enforcement from both CBP and also the Department of Justice.
So going down that road, if it's looked at as more of a criminal manner, and maybe this is a somewhat new development here. First off, it sounds like the Department of Justice are raising the bar on these kinds of infractions. So the seriousness is even greater now. But with that, I guess the question would be, all right, well, can a company president or an executive or a middle management person that is involved in overseeing maybe some of the purchasing or the imports or whatever the case may be, would they be able to basically push this kind of infraction down to their staff and say, I didn't know about it, and go from there? Or who are they going to go after here? Or do you know that yet?
Sure. I mean, so it remains to be seen exactly who they're going to go after. I think that the one bit of positive news in all this scariness is that, to prove fraud, there are certain legal elements, right? I mean, this is a situation where the government will have to prove that someone knowingly and willingly did this, i.e., they did it intentionally, right? And so I think that that's sort of a hard threshold. It's a very high threshold to cross. And so I think when the Department of Justice starts bringing these kinds of cases, they're going to be pretty egregious cases, right? I mean, I think it's going to be, situations where people knew that they were avoiding 100% duties. Maybe they were declaring the value at half of what it should have been. They were using, a classification that they shouldn't have been. I mean, it's going to be pretty glaringly obvious that someone knew what they were doing was wrong and they still did it anyway. And so, I think the vast majority of companies that have import compliance operations, and that are trying to do the right thing, I don't think that you could really you could try to make an allegation of fraud, but I think it's going to be hard to really stick in court.
So with that, I mean, the short term that I'm thinking is going to be, and I say short term, meaning the short term action the government may take, is that they come across something, they're going to, seize the goods or, refuse entry of them or those kinds of things. But it also may then open up a can of worms where, okay, we see an infraction here. Maybe there's been other things that have gone on. And so they're going to start probably, logically you would think, well, here comes some CF-28, CF-29s possibly, but then maybe even an audit to start looking into some things. And then if that determines something, then from there I could see where the criminal would get into play.
I mean, logically that makes sense, but I think it plays out in different ways. And I think with these kinds of fraud allegations, the government tends to sort of sit back and wait, right? They're going to let you enter those goods, and they're going to be watching what you're doing and kind of building their case, right? So like the one historical case that most people in the importing community know about is the honey fraud cases, which was back.
Oh yes, I forgot about those, but that was a big deal.
It was
where people they were changing the country of origin of the honey, were they not?
That's part of it. That's one thing that was happening, and it happened on thousands of containers, right? I mean, the government let this, go on while they built their case. The other thing that was happening too was adulteration, right? So you're not allowed to have certain chemicals and certain things in the honey, and they were they were modifying the certificates of analysis, saying, "Oh no, this honey doesn't have these kinds of bad antibiotics and chemicals like that."
And it was from such a manner that it was also, additives, whatever, as I recall in it, that there were things other than honey. I mean, it was like, rather than saying it was honey, they were, I don't know, adding things to make it a bigger batch, but it wasn't all true honey. All right. So with that, in that particular scenario, then is if you're using it as an example, what was, to be honest, I remember there was a big deal about that. And there was a lot of that coming out of China, if I recall, and the Far East. But and Vietnam, I think, was another place. But regardless, what did come out of that?
So I think ultimately there were more than 24 criminal convictions as a result of that, and I think tens of millions of dollars of fines were paid. So and I was reading an article recently about it. At least for one person that they prosecuted, this individual had entered almost 800 containers of honey. So it's not. I think the government was definitely building their case as these things came in, and I think to your point about you start in one place and then you kind of peel off the onion and see what you can find. And I think that's kind of what it was with honey, right? They found maybe one person who was doing something wrong and then started connecting all the pieces to the puzzle and realizing it was a much bigger problem.
So I mean, I think I'm going to try to jump into this, what you all are saying, but have you seen that this can also extend to like further down in the supply chain, the criminal, liability? Like, can it extend to like the freight forwarding companies or like all your service providers that are involved in this, even though they don't know that this is happening? Like, do you think that they can be held liable as well?
So it really depends. I mean, with fraud and these kinds of cases, the party needs to have knowledge about it and still have done it anyway, right? I mean, if they honestly didn't know, right, they're just the broker, they're just entering the goods. I don't think liability would extend in that particular instance. But you do raise a good question. The statute itself does not limit liability to the importer of record, right? And I think most times when you're having these conversations with clients, everyone's like, well, the importer of record is responsible, so I don't need to worry about anything. And I think, with these particular criminal statutes, the liability is not just limited to the importer of record. But the caveat there is that, the other party involved, even if they're not the importer of record, has to be sort of involved in the scheme, right? They can't just be sort of a non-interested party that doesn't know anything. But if they're really involved in the scheme, then they're fair game for the Department of Justice to go after.
Well, and if it goes down the criminal road like this, is it not? I mean, people are going to be doing jail time. It's not just going to be a penalty that's paid or something like that. We're talking, a felony, and we're talking, federal prison, probably more than likely.
Right, that's right. They're federal statutes, and the statutes that I listed in my article, the criminal statutes, they range from maximum penalties of 2 years to up to 20 years in prison. So they're very, very serious statutes. So
in looking at this, I guess, all right, we've established that the federal government is making this one of the top priorities as far as investigating fraud allegations and whatnot. So if I'm a company and I'm buying my product and sourcing it out there, I guess the question comes into play is, what is it that I should be doing if I've got a new supplier, for example? There's a lot of people that are trying to move away from China, for example, but you've got to vet your supplier and whatnot. And I guess in this, is there a risk that you're unknowingly allowing somebody to present something or sell something to you that is not as it's presented, and you're caught up in a potential fraud from the supplier? Or is this something that you're looking at saying, people, just because there's tariffs now, or maybe some tariffs, don't take actions that would circumvent that? I mean, or is it both?
I mean, I guess I would say it's probably maybe the former. Like, you still have to do your due diligence, right? And so if you're doing your due diligence, I don't think you end up in a fraud situation, right? Like if you, let's say you're changing suppliers, and you need to verify the country of origin, right? You're going to go and you're going to look at their production process. We're not in the COVID days anymore, so we can travel now. And so, going out there, going to see the factory, going to see the production happening, looking at the bill of materials, seeing, where all the inputs are coming from. You got to do that homework. And if you're doing that homework, and the pricing makes sense, right? Then I don't think you're in a fraud situation. Now, if you're in a situation where, the duties are 100%, and somehow the price is still the same, I think you kind of have to be asking questions there, right? I mean, I don't know if that rises to the level of fraud, but I think you certainly have a little bit of a responsibility to be like, how is it possible that your price can stay the same if the duties are now 100%, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's it. I mean, I always look at this, and I keep making this statement where people are looking at tariffs being punitive or whatever. I mean, the use of tariffs generally is to motivate a country, if you will, to modify their behavior. There's something going on that, like the use of forced labor, or, in this case, the accusation is unfair trade practices. Okay, you've got high tariffs on ours. We're going to put high tariffs on these products. The scenario here is then people trying to circumvent, through that. I guess that's in looking at it, what should be the message from, I guess, the senior executives, how to ensure that somebody is just not trying to meet their budget, whether it's in middle management, or if you're in middle management and executives are trying to say, hey, we just come up with a way to, cut the price on this without, I don't want to know the details. Was like, well, wait a minute.
I think we're in a very interesting time right now in that, senior executives at companies are really paying attention to import compliance in a way that I don't think they ever have before because of enforcement. But I mean, the main reason, of course, is because tariffs, and that's hitting the bottom line. But I think also because of enforcement. And so, I think executives are more willing to put the resources into making sure that they have good import compliance procedures these days, because the stakes are so high, right? I mean, if you, going back to your example of changing suppliers, right? Let's say you're moving out of China and you go to Malaysia, and, you're importing a good that at 10%, that you thought was country of origin Malaysia, and it turns out customs disagrees, and now you're looking at, the difference of, let's say, 145 versus 10% over many, many years. I mean, that's going to be a huge, huge hit to the business. And so I think that companies are certainly, and executives are willing to invest the time to get it right. Maybe go to customs and get a ruling on that particular transaction and see if it makes sense. And I think on the whole, importers and companies are trying to do the right thing. I think for the most part, the notion that you can easily get around these tariffs has been dispelled. Every now and again, there are rumors of, the supplier will do DDP and the price will be super low. But I think most importers know that that's too good to be true.
To what extent, EJ, do you feel this also extends to, let's just not talk about let's just talk about North America now, about, the free trade agreement with USMCA. The, my entire career almost has been in cross-border international trade. It started in software, and now it's in training and educating folks about how, like in this case, USMCA, how that works, and how that's not just because you're manufacturing in the U.S. or Mexico or Canada, is it automatically, of that region, right? I mean, it might say made in Mexico, but it's not USMCA qualified, So with the with all this going on since Trump took office, there was that let's call it that waiver that you got of that 25% IEPA duties if you claimed your product as USMCA, whereas people in the past never really did it because, or may have not done it, I'm sorry, because of maybe their products were 0% or whatnot. Have you seen, or how is that enforcement, have they come down, or I don't know, like in your experience, what have you seen with those companies that all of a sudden are saying, yeah, well, I am USMCA, I manufacture in Mexico, so it's obviously it's USMCA. I don't know what advice or what have you seen on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, it's been an area of interest, right? Because everyone wants to try to avoid those 25% duties, those IEPA duties that were on Canada and Mexico. I think that, I mean, I'm not aware of any major enforcement right now that's been happening on that. I think some CF-28s have definitely, been issued to probe companies about whether or not they really qualify. But I don't, I think that's kind of one of those areas where Customs is kind of sitting back and waiting for the dust to settle before taking action. I think that, I don't know, that's just been my general experience with Customs, is that they kind of, right now they're letting all these entries come in. There's some CF-28, CF-29s going out, but I think what's more likely to happen is, a year, 2 years from now, we're really going to start seeing an uptick in, 28s, 29s, and the focus on, did you do it right back then? I think, just like for one example, on the 232 exclusion front, 232 exclusions are now dead, right? Because there's no more system in place. But now you have Customs launching investigations for companies that are alleged to have overused their exclusions. That's been a big thing that's been happening the past couple weeks. And so, those exclusions date back years, and now Customs is getting around to looking into that. So I think you're going to see sort of a similar trend with the USMCA compliance part of this as well.
Well, and for our listeners, the 232 tariffs, that's the steel and aluminum, right? Added tariffs on steel and aluminum products.
Right. And now also you have 25% on automobiles and auto parts as well.
Right.
Right. And I guess just that everybody's aware, just because you brought your shipment in and cleared and you're good to go, and 3 years later you think you're still clear, that's not true. It's for you, they can go back 5 years. So make sure that you do have all your documentation and you have that in store somewhere where you can easily pull out that audit. Andy, you're really good about saying that, like how good is your data if you're not, if it's not going to back you up or something like that, right?
Well, and I was just going to say, Lally, you're making a great point. This is one of those where one of the things that's a big activity right now is tariff engineering, and it's legal. But folks, for those that maybe it's like, what is he talking about? Tariff engineering is where you take a product, and let's say that it's got a very high tariff rate or duty rate on it, let's say 75% or whatever it is. You could then look at it and say, can we redesign this and add components or take components away or whatever, and it would change the classification of that. That's called tariff engineering from a standpoint to say, could we do this and look at that? And by doing that, that's okay. What's not okay is saying, okay, we're going to shift some things around And we are adding now a component to this that may now all of a sudden your product was stood on its own as far as classification. And now you've got an anti-dumping or countervailing duty case that's pending on some things. And so you're adding a component to that now all of a sudden it's an ADD CVD and you're not claiming that or don't realize that. So it's like, it's always good to have an expert that is involved in this and researching these things if you're looking at making those changes. But what is your thoughts there, EJ, regarding, if somebody's looking at it and going, what should I do? And they start going down the road of tariff engineering. Is that okay, or is it not okay, or what are the cautions, or what do you advise there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think your general point was right that yes, it's potentially legal. It's just, I think our advice, generally speaking, these days has been a lot of, we think X, right? We think this is okay, but given all the tariffs and the consequence of being wrong, you really should request a ruling, right, with customs. I mean, that has been through and through, I think, one of the most common things we're saying these days because, if you're, again, I keep going back to China because that's, at one point we were at least 145% plus 301 duties. And, the consequence of being wrong is just, it's too much to bear, right? I mean, and so, and furthermore, if it's not overly complicated, you can get a ruling out of customs, fairly quickly. And so, I would always caveat anything with, especially if there's any doubt, get a ruling, because you really can never be too sure. Just because you can make an argument and you can find some rulings that are on point, maybe the explanatory notes are helpful. I think it really does make sense to just push for that ruling just to get the okay from customs, so you don't end up with a massive tariff bill 3-4 years down the road.
Well, and one of the things I will say, this comes into, as far as our listeners, folks, this would be something that you've got some manufacturing facilities all over the U.S. and in some rural areas and some small areas. I'm actually in Searcy, Arkansas right now. So in the central Arkansas areas, there's a lot of manufacturing and different things. And your raw goods or components, you're sourcing those from different parts of the world. And as they come in, you may be then, manufacturing your own widget there here in the U.S., but it's got components. This is one of those things where if there are questions and you've never done this before, the risk has been fairly low on some things and you make some changes. Now, just like EJ just said, the ball game has changed and the risk is just too high. And if you're changing things, invest in an expert to come in and take a look at some things, whether it's a trade attorney, whether it's some consultants, or if you've got somebody on staff that can look at it. Some of your customs brokers can do some of this, but we're talking beyond just doing an entry. EJ, you're talking about most attorneys are reactionary type services, right? It's like, okay, I've done stepped in it. So, I need a professional pooper scooper at the end of the parade here to get me out of this mess, right? So what we're talking about and what you're kind of pointing out, this is like, don't go down that road. Don't wait that long, right? It's like, what should be some things that people are looking at? I mean, I'm a big proponent to, as I just said, get your experts if you don't have that expertise. And even if you do, it would be good to say, let me get somebody or an opinion to validate what I think is going on.
Right. Right. I think it's very smart in this climate to be proactive instead of reactive. And I think that, trade lawyers, consultants can certainly help with just getting your procedures set up, right? So, making sure you have written procedures for classification, making sure you have things for country of origin, procedures for what you do if there is a mistake, procedures for post-entry audit examinations. And so I think, having an attorney or even having someone in-house draft and then having an attorney look at it to make sure that you've got all your bases covered, I think is step one. You have those procedures in place, and then, you go 6 months and then there's a problem. You can look back at those procedures. You can consult, your experts, like Andy was saying. But yeah, definitely, I think it's certainly really helpful to set up the procedures first, and before you have a problem.
Do you, by chance, people can usually relate to stories, right? Is there a story of something where, somebody was out doing some of this kind of stuff and you're thinking, what were they thinking of? Or, as far as going down, it's like what not to do as far as for our folks here.
I think that there's a surprising number of instances where, companies will get CF-28s and just think it's very innocuous, and not think that it's a big deal. And lo and behold, they're actually maybe under investigation. Maybe someone's made an allegation. And so the company doesn't even know it. And so because they look so just sort of routine, mundane, there have been a lot of instances where companies have responded to those CF-28s in ways that were really not helpful. And so, we've always advised clients, if you get a CF-28, talk to somebody, talk to an expert, talk to a lawyer, because you don't know. And particularly in the EPA investigation context, the Enforce and Protect Act, the way that Customs starts those usually, well, first off, they get an allegation, and then even before they initiate the investigation, they will issue CF-28s. And so depending on how you answer those, the case might get initiated, but you're essentially under investigation for 60 to 90 days before you even know it. And so I think that's definitely a big a common thing that we sometimes see, and it's unfortunate because we're like, dang, we really wish we could have helped you before this all got started.
And then it's kind of too late for our listeners. Let me back up. I just realized something. We've been talking about CF-28s and 29s. A CF-28 is a Customs Form 28 that is Customs is actually formalizing a question. They're doing an inquiry on your entry, your shipment, or something to that effect. A CF-29, again, Customs Form 29 in this case, is where Customs is doing an inquiry, but at the same time, they've taken action to say, you've classified it as, classification 1, and we're putting it in classification 2 and going ahead and assessing the duties and taxes based on that. So a CF-28 or 29 is like it, especially 28. That's like an indicator. There's something going on. Somebody's poking around, looking at something. And like you said, boy, don't take those lightly. That would give you an indication that, you know what, we need to step back here and look to see, do we have everything in order, right? So, well, I will say, EJ, this has been a good discussion. Lila, I keep asking questions. I start going on this, and I'm like that horse you got to pull up on rather than kicking the backside.
No, we're good. I mean, I think we're about towards the end of of our time anyway. So I guess about the only other thing I can ask, and really it's just our usual wrap-up question, like what would you have any last words of advice or any best practices or just any sound advice? And I know this is not a legal advice or anything like that. And we make sure that everybody in the show understands that, we have a disclaimer where it says it's absolutely not legal advice. It's just for entertainment and informational purposes. But do you have any closing words that you might want to provide here?
Nuggets of knowledge.
I really think on this topic, the biggest thing is just having procedures in place. Most importers are trying to do the right thing. They really are. But I think we find it in a lot of instances, people don't have written procedures in place. And so I think the biggest thing to sort of defend yourself in these kinds of situations whether it's an audit from customs or whether it's even a criminal investigation like this, is to have those procedures written down in place, and demonstrating that you followed these types of procedures. So I think getting counsel, getting consultants in to help you write the procedures, draft the procedures, review the procedures, to make sure you're prepared in the event that anything happens, I think is really the main takeaway here.
Well, EJ, that's some great advice. I will say to our listeners, this is one that, again, you may need to forward this on to some of your upper or middle management folks to listen to this and say, hey, the ball game has greater risk now as far as import and export and international trade and all those kinds of things. So with that, I also will say thank you to our listeners. You guys have been fantastic. We keep growing, but Lalo and I, man, we are so humbled by your support, and keep sharing us, keep liking us, subscribe, follow, whatever we got to do. Look at us on LinkedIn. EJ Thomas, he's another one. Reach out on LinkedIn there. This is one of the sharper tools in the shed rather than some of the folks like us. So, well, listen, thank you, EJ. Lalo, any other things we need to do?
No, we're good to go. Thank you, EJ, again for replying to my reach out there, and I'm glad that we connected.
Thank you, Lalo. Thank you, Andy. Appreciate it.
Folks, have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.